August 21st, 1944. A secure communication room deep within the Reich Chancellery, Berlin. General Oberst Alfred Jodl spread reconnaissance photographs across the polished oak table before his logistics staff. The images, taken by one of the Luftwaffe's few remaining reconnaissance aircraft over northern France, showed something that defied German military understanding. An unbroken chain of vehicles stretched eastward from the Normandy coast, headlights blazing in full view. No spacing between trucks, no concealment, no adherence to any doctrine Jodl recognized from 3 decades of military service. His chief logistics officer, Oberst Heinrich Müller, had calculated the numbers 3 times, refusing to believe his own mathematics. Herr General, if these reconnaissance counts are accurate, the Americans are moving between 11,000 and 13,000 tons daily. This exceeds the capacity of the French rail system before we destroyed it. It exceeds our own logistics capacity in Russia at peak efficiency. The calculation must be wrong. Jodl studied the photographs in silence. He had commanded German forces with distinction since 1939. He understood logistics as well as any officer in the Wehrmacht, and he understood that what these photographs showed was impossible by every principle of military science he had spent his career mastering. American truck convoys operating in daylight and darkness, moving continuously without pause, consuming fuel at rates that should have exhausted any army's reserves within days, transporting tonnages that should have required rail infrastructure, Germany had systematically destroyed during its retreat from Normandy. The Americans have outrun their supply lines, Jodl announced to his staff with certainty born of experience. Patton's Third Army is advancing 60 to 70 miles per week. No army in history has sustained such operational tempo beyond 400 miles from its supply bases. Basic physics prevents it. Every mile of advance doubles fuel consumption just for transport. The Americans will halt within 72 hours. We need only hold defensive positions at the Seine. Their offensive will collapse from logistics failure before we fire a shot. What Jodl didn't know, couldn't have known because German military doctrine had never conceived such an operation possible, was that 130 miles to the west, 5,958 trucks were already rolling through the French countryside in an endless mechanical river. They moved in convoys that stretched for miles, headlights illuminated despite blackout regulations, carrying supplies at speeds and quantities that would have seemed like propaganda if German intelligence hadn't verified the numbers repeatedly. This operation, designated the Red Ball Express by Americans who borrowed the name from their railroad industry's term for priority freight, was about to demonstrate that modern warfare had fundamentally changed, that industrial capacity now mattered more than tactical brilliance, that America's factories had created a form of military power Germany had no counter for. The Red Ball Express would deliver over 400,000 tons of supplies in 83 days of continuous operations. It would keep Patton's armies advancing when German calculations proved they must halt. It would demonstrate that American logistics operated on principles so different from European precedent that German officers who witnessed it couldn't process what they were seeing. And it would prove that in mechanized warfare, the side with the most trucks often defeats the side with the best tanks. Within 2 weeks of Jodl's confident prediction, Patton's forces would liberate Paris, supplied by convoys that never stopped rolling, driven by soldiers Germany's racial theorists claimed were inferior, sustained by an industrial system that treated logistics challenges as 1902, problems to be overwhelmed rather than obstacles requiring careful planning. The German General Staff was about to receive an education in American industrial warfare. The lesson would be delivered at 35 miles per hour by 23,000 truck drivers, 75% of them African American, who would revolutionize military logistics while simultaneously undermining Nazi racial ideology. The Red Ball Express represented everything Germany had failed to understand about America, not just industrial capacity, though that mattered immensely, not just mechanical aptitude, though American soldiers proved remarkably skilled at improvisation, but a fundamental difference in how Americans approached problems. Where Germans saw careful planning and resource conservation, Americans saw abundance and speed. Where Germans calculated optimal efficiency, Americans built massive overcapacity and accepted waste as a cost of tempo. Where Germans followed doctrine, Americans invented solutions on the spot. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The confidence German logistics planners felt in late August 1944 stemmed from hard-won experience across 5 years of mechanized warfare. The Wehrmacht had pioneered the operational concepts that revolutionized military operations. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of coordinated armor, infantry, and air power moving at speeds that paralyzed defenders, had shattered Polish, French, and Soviet armies in campaigns that redefined what was tactically possible. But German officers understood intimately the tyranny of supply lines. Every successful blitzkrieg operation had eventually stalled when logistics failed to keep pace with tactical success. In Russia, Wehrmacht advances had foundered not initially from Soviet resistance, but from the simple inability to supply mechanized forces across vast distances. German trucks, built by dozens of different manufacturers to varying specifications, broke down on Russian roads. Spare parts for one model didn't fit another. Mechanics trained on Opel trucks couldn't service Mercedes vehicles. The fragmentation of German industry, with over 150 different truck models in military service, created maintenance nightmares that never fully resolved. More fundamentally, Germany had never fully mechanized its military. Wehrmacht units in 1944 still relied on horse-drawn transport for approximately 80% of their logistics needs. 3 million horses served in German military units during the war, consuming enormous quantities of fodder, limiting operational tempo to the speed of walking animals, and creating vulnerabilities that mechanized enemies ruthlessly exploited. Each horse required 12 pounds of oats and 15 pounds of hay daily, plus constant water access. A German infantry division typically included 4,000 to 6,000 horses pulling 1,500 wagons. Feeding these animals consumed transport capacity that could otherwise move ammunition and fuel. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps, had written in his operational diary in July 1944, "The Americans face the same logistical impossibility we encountered in Russia. Distance defeats even the strongest armies. Their mechanical advantage becomes a disadvantage when fuel consumption exceeds supply capacity. Machines require constant feeding. Animals can forage. The Americans have advanced 400 miles in 40 days. History teaches what comes next: paralysis." German intelligence meticulously tracked American consumption rates using a combination of reconnaissance, document capture, and analysis of American operational patterns. A single Sherman tank burned half a mile per gallon on roads, significantly worse cross-country. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily for sustained combat operations. An armoured division needed 1,000 tons or more, depending on operational intensity. Ammunition consumption alone could exceed 300 tons daily during major offensives. Patton commanded 12 divisions, advancing on a 60-mile front by late August. The mathematics seemed irrefutable to German logistics officers who had spent careers managing scarcity. 12,000 tons daily minimum, transported 400 miles from the beaches over roads the Wehrmacht had systematically destroyed during its retreat. Through a rail network Allied bombing had rendered completely non-functional. General Major Siegfried Westphal, who would become Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt in September, calculated on August 20th. Even if the Americans possessed unlimited trucks, which intelligence indicates they do not, and perfect roads, which clearly they lack, and zero mechanical failures, which physics makes impossible, they still cannot sustain Patton's advance more than 72 hours. Physical laws cannot be violated, not even by American industry. This confidence reflected German understanding of logistics as a zero-sum equation. Distance times tonnage divided by vehicle capacity equals time. The Wehrmacht had operated under these constraints for 5 years, learning painfully that advancing armies eventually reached a culminating point where supply lines could no longer sustain forward momentum. Every German operational plan incorporated calculated pauses for logistics to catch up with tactical success. The Americans, German planners assumed, would face the same physical limitations. What German calculations missed entirely was the scale of American industrial capacity and the completely different operational philosophy this abundance enabled. Where German logistics emphasized careful planning and resource conservation, American logistics accepted waste as a necessary cost of maintaining tempo. Where Germans calculated precise requirements and allocated accordingly, Americans built massive overcapacity and let excess capacity absorb inefficiencies. On August 25, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau near Valognes, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Eyre of the Motor Transport Service faced a room full of skeptical transportation officers. The situation reports were stark. Patton's Third Army was consuming supplies faster than any army in history while advancing at speeds that defied all logistics planning. Traditional supply methods had collapsed. Rail transport was impossible with French railways destroyed. Scheduled convoys created bottlenecks. Depot-to-depot distribution couldn't maintain adequate forward stocks. "Gentlemen," Eyre announced, "we're going to create a one-way highway system from the ports to the front lines. Every truck will operate 20 hours out of 24. No stopping, except for fuel and mechanical emergencies. We will move 12,500 tons daily, minimum. I don't want to hear about regulations or doctrine. I want solutions that work." The concept was breathtakingly simple in outline, staggeringly complex in execution. 2 parallel one-way highways, one for loaded trucks moving toward the front, one for empty vehicles returning to the beaches. 24-hour operations, with headlights fully illuminated, abandoning blackout discipline entirely. No stop policy, except for fuel and breakdown. 5-minute intervals between convoys, maintaining 35-mile-per-hour average speeds. Mobile maintenance units every 50 miles to handle repairs. Military police checkpoints, removing any vehicle traveling below 25 miles per hour from the convoy system. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of Communications Zone, reviewed the projected numbers with growing concern. "We need 140 truck companies, minimum 6,000 vehicles operating at 90% availability. By every logistics textbook ever written, this is impossible. The mechanical failure rate alone will destroy your convoy system within a week." Yet, within 36 hours, the impossible became operational. On August 26, 1944, drivers from the 396th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, universally nicknamed Deuce and a Half by soldiers who drove them. Loaded with 105mm artillery shells bound for Patton's guns at Le Mans, 300 miles east. The cargo would arrive in 14 hours, faster than German intelligence officers would believe possible when they captured American logistics documents describing the operation. The demographic composition of the Red Ball Express would have provided stunning propaganda opportunities if Americans had chosen to publicize it. Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually operate the system, approximately 75% were African American soldiers serving in a still segregated military. These men, systematically denied equal rights in civilian America and relegated to non-combat support roles in a military that doubted their capabilities, were keeping the most celebrated white general's army in motion. They were proving Hitler's racial theories catastrophically wrong with every mile driven, every ton delivered, every impossible deadline met. The irony was lost on no one, least of all the drivers themselves. They served a nation that wouldn't let them eat in white restaurants or use white facilities in much of America. They wore the uniform of an army that officially considered them unsuitable for combat roles. Yet they were performing a mission as dangerous and demanding as any combat operation, driving through potentially hostile territory, operating under constant pressure, pushing their physical limits to sustain armies fighting for freedom they themselves didn't fully enjoy at home. The drivers developed their own culture within hours of operations beginning. They painted slogans on their trucks that reflected both pride and sardonic awareness of their situation. Patton's blood bank appeared on vehicles carrying ammunition. Hitler, here we come, decorated trucks hauling fuel. Detroit to Berlin Express proclaimed vehicles carrying rations. These unauthorized markings violated military regulations completely. No one ordered them removed. The mission mattered more than regulations. They created traffic rules born of necessity rather than doctrine. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately when faster convoys approached. Mechanical failures were pushed into ditches rather than creating roadblocks. Any truck maintaining less than 20 miles per hour was considered an obstruction to be removed from the route by any means necessary. Military police enforced these improvised rules with aggressive efficiency. The red ball moved, or it didn't move. There was no middle ground. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units began reporting observations that contradicted everything Wehrmacht doctrine taught about military operations. Units from Aufklärung 116 radioed from concealed positions overlooking the main red ball route, continuous vehicle column visible from our observation post. Headlights illuminate for 20 kilometers. No spacing between vehicles. No blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour passing our position. Americans have abandoned all military precaution. They operate as if they control the airspace completely and fear no interdiction. This violated every principle German military science considered fundamental. Headlights at night invited air attack from any aircraft within visual range. Continuous columns with no spacing presented perfect targets for artillery or interdiction raids. A single disabled truck without proper spacing could halt an entire convoy for hours. Yet the Americans seemed utterly unconcerned with these vulnerabilities. They drove with full lights blazing, trusting in Allied air superiority to protect them from Luftwaffe attack that German intelligence indicated was impossible to mount anyway given the collapse of German air power in France. General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions near Argentan on August 30th. His report to Army Group B headquarters reflected growing alarm that went beyond tactical concerns to fundamental questions about German ability to compete with American industrial capacity. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass our observation point at 30-second intervals, day and night, without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any doctrine we recognize. It isn't military science as we understand it. It's mass production applied to warfare. They're treating military logistics like a factory assembly line. What Germans couldn't understand was that American logistics operated on completely different first principles than European military tradition. Where German doctrine emphasized concealment to avoid becoming targets, Americans relied on volume and speed. If some trucks got hit, thousands more would get through. Where Germans conserved vehicles like precious capital assets, Americans assumed 20% mechanical failure rates and simply deployed enough extra capacity to absorb losses. Where Germans followed strict military procedures developed over decades, Americans improvised continuously and empowered junior leaders to make decisions that in the Wehrmacht would require approval from corps-level command. The numbers the Red Ball Express achieved in its first week of operations defied every German calculation of what was logistically possible using road transport exclusively. First week, August 25th through 31st, 1944, 89,939 tons of supplies delivered. Daily average of 12,848 tons. Round-trip distance of 686 miles for vehicles completing full cycles. Vehicle rotations averaging 1.5 trips daily for the 5,958 trucks in the system. Fuel consumed by the Red Ball operation itself, not counting fuel transported, 300,000 gallons daily. German logistics specialists who captured these figures from American documents initially dismissed them as propaganda fabrications. The numbers seemed physically impossible. No military in European history had sustained such tonnage delivery using only wheeled transport. Yet, interrogation of American prisoners and observation from concealed positions confirmed the statistics were accurate. The Americans were actually doing what German science said couldn't be done. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had established an operational rhythm that seemed to mock German logistics limitations. Convoys departed every 5 minutes from the western terminus at assigned staging areas. Average convoy size was 67 vehicles, carrying 5 tons per truck as standard load, frequently overloaded to 7 tons when urgency demanded. Time to cover 350 miles one-way averaged 14 hours, including fuel stops. Turnaround time at each terminus was 2 hours for unloading, vehicle inspection, and driver rest. At any given moment, 5,000 vehicles were in constant motion somewhere on the Red Ball route system. The Red Ball Express generated innovations hourly, as drivers and mechanics solved problems on the spot that German military regulations would have required weeks of bureaucratic process to address. When trucks broke down, approximately 1,800 daily across the entire fleet, mobile, maintenance units performed roadside repairs using a brutal triage system. 15 minutes to diagnose and fix, or the vehicle got pushed off the road and cannibalized for parts. Engines were swapped in 45 minutes using mobile cranes that followed the convoys. Transmissions were replaced in an hour. Any repair requiring more time meant abandoning the vehicle entirely and redistributing its cargo to other trucks. When the designated Red Ball routes became congested despite the one-way highway system, drivers created solutions without waiting for orders from headquarters. They commandeered French civilian buses to transport drivers back to starting points, freeing trucks to carry cargo instead of personnel. They liberated abandoned German vehicles, painting them olive drab and pressing them into Red Ball service without bothering to request authorization. They built improvised bypasses around destroyed bridges using rubble from bombed buildings as roadbed, completing in hours what engineer doctrine said required days of preparation. The Germans, observing this organized chaos from defensive positions, couldn't comprehend how it produced results. German logistics doctrine emphasized careful planning, rigid maintenance schedules, and proper procedures for every contingency. The Americans violated every principle German officers had learned at military academies and through years of field experience. Yet their system didn't collapse into dysfunction as German doctrine predicted it must. Instead, it accelerated, delivering more tonnage daily as drivers learned the routes and mechanics refined their rapid repair techniques. The most stunning revelation for German observers was American fuel management. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just for its own operations, more fuel than many German armies received for all purposes, including combat operations. Yet fuel never ran short for Red Ball trucks. The Americans had created parallel supply systems that German intelligence hadn't fully mapped. Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, was laying fuel lines across the English Channel that German reconnaissance never detected until after the war. By September 1944, refined petroleum products flowed through underwater pipes, directly from English refineries to French beaches, bypassing the tanker transport German U-boats had been designed to interdict. Forward fuel dumps were established every 25 miles along Red Ball routes, each containing hundreds of thousands of gallons. Tanker trucks ran their own dedicated convoy system parallel to the main Red Ball, ensuring no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes for refueling at any point along the route. General Major Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations for OKW, observed from aerial reconnaissance photographs compiled from multiple sources. The Americans have created fuel dumps larger than our entire strategic petroleum reserves. They burn more gasoline, transporting gasoline than we allocate to entire panzer divisions for offensive operations. This isn't warfare as we understand it. This is industrial overflow. They have so much of everything that they can waste prodigiously and still maintain overwhelming material superiority. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply Patton's advance. It multiplied its speed exponentially in ways that shattered German defensive planning at the operational level. German military doctrine, refined through 5 years of mechanized warfare, calculated that an armored division could sustain 20 to 30-mile daily advances under optimal conditions with adequate logistics support. This calculation assumed periodic pauses for fuel replenishment, ammunition resupply, and mechanical maintenance that every European army considered inevitable. Patton's divisions, supplied by the Red Ball Express, averaged 40 to 60-mile daily advances for weeks without the logistics. Pauses German planning assumed were physically mandatory. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armoured Division advanced 35 miles in morning operations, paused at noon for what German observers assumed would be an extended resupply period lasting hours, and instead found Red Ball trucks already waiting with fuel and ammunition. The division resumed its advance within 45 minutes and covered another 32 miles before nightfall. This 67-mile single-day advance was operationally impossible by every German calculation of what mechanized forces could sustain. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, reviewing intelligence reports at OKW headquarters in East Prussia, initially refused to accept them as accurate. No armoured force can advance 60 miles daily for extended periods. Mechanical failures alone prevent such sustained tempo, even assuming unlimited fuel. This intelligence must represent misidentification of different units or propaganda. Exaggeration. Order immediate verification through alternative sources. But intercepted American radio traffic confirmed the impossible. More disturbing for German commanders attempting to establish defensive lines, the Americans were broadcasting their positions openly without encryption, supremely confident that even if Germans knew exactly where American spearheads were located, Wehrmacht forces lacked the mobility or resources to respond effectively before American units advanced again. By September 5, 1944, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive reports on the Red Ball Express for distribution to Army Group commanders. The implications were catastrophic for Wehrmacht operational planning. Every assumption about American military capabilities required fundamental revision. The intelligence summary contained observations that defied German military science and challenged basic assumptions about what was logistically possible in mechanized warfare. Americans waste vehicles prodigiously, the report noted with barely concealed disbelief. Damaged trucks are frequently abandoned rather than repaired when repairs would delay convoy schedules more than 30 minutes. Estimate American forces have abandoned over 1,500 vehicles along supply routes, many requiring only minor repairs by our maintenance standards. This represents material waste no European military could sustain, yet American operations show no degradation from these losses. Driver management violates all personnel doctrine, the analysis continued. Captured American soldiers report drivers operating on stimulants for 72 continuous hours with minimal rest. Medical officers would consider this abuse of personnel in Wehrmacht. Americans treat it as acceptable cost of maintaining delivery schedules. Casualty rates from accidents exceed combat losses in some transportation units, yet morale remains extraordinarily high according to prisoner. Interrogation. No camouflage discipline whatsoever, another section reported. The entire supply system operates in full visibility, making it vulnerable to air interdiction that fortunately we cannot mount due to Luftwaffe's current operational limitations. Americans apparently assume air superiority is absolute and permanent. This assumption appears completely justified based on observed air operations over supply routes. Mechanical failure rates of 30% daily are simply overwhelmed by numerical redundancy. The report observed with frustration. Where Wehrmacht doctrine emphasizes maintaining high operational readiness through careful maintenance, Americans deploy such massive excess capacity that they sustain operations despite failure rates that would cripple our logistics entirely. They have more trucks in reserve than we have in total inventory. Fuel consumption that would bankrupt any European military. The summary concluded bleakly. Americans consume more petroleum products daily for logistics operations alone than Germany's entire civilian economy receives monthly. This represents resource access on a scale beyond our competition. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial civilization that has devoted its full capacity to military purposes. Field Marshal Walter Model's response to this intelligence assessment revealed the growing desperation in German high command as they recognized the true scale of the challenge they faced. If these reports are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt our intelligence officers' competence, we face not merely a superior army, but a superior civilization. The Americans make no effort to conceal their supply operations because they genuinely do not fear us. They waste resources on a scale we consider criminal because they possess effectively infinite resources from our perspective. We cannot defeat this with superior tactics or operational brilliance. Industrial capacity has become the decisive factor in modern warfare, and we are comprehensively outmatched. The Red Ball Express drivers paid a physical price that German observers monitoring from concealed positions couldn't fully appreciate. Drivers routinely operated for 72 straight hours, sustained by benzodrine tablets and determination, hallucinating from exhaustion as they struggled to maintain schedules that kept Patton's spearheads advancing. Accidents killed approximately 300 drivers during the Red Ball's operational period. Trucks collided in fog that reduced visibility to yards. Vehicles overturned on roads damaged by combat and weather. Engines caught fire from being pushed beyond their design specifications, igniting fuel or cargo. Yet morale remained extraordinarily high in ways that baffled German officers accustomed to Wehrmacht discipline, maintained through rigid hierarchy and fear of punishment. These men, mostly African-American soldiers, denied equal rights in civilian America, and relegated to non-combat roles in a military that doubted their capabilities, understood they were making history that transcended their individual circumstances. They were proving Hitler's racial theories catastrophically wrong with every mile driven, every deadline met, every ton delivered. They were demonstrating capabilities that American military leadership had doubted and that Nazi ideology declared impossible. Private John Mitchell, a 20-year-old driver from Baltimore serving with the 558th Quartermaster Truck Company, later described his motivation in oral history interviews preserved by the Veterans History Project. "We knew what the Germans thought about colored soldiers. They'd been told we were inferior, couldn't handle technical equipment, lacked discipline and initiative. Every load we delivered on time proved them wrong. Every mile we drove without getting lost proved them wrong. We were fighting two wars, fighting Germany with the supplies we hold, and fighting racism by proving we could do this job better than anyone imagined." Captured German officers provided eloquent testimony to the Red Ball Express's psychological impact in interrogation sessions conducted by American intelligence. Oberst Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September 1944 after his unit was encircled when American advances outpaced German retreat capabilities, told interrogators with remarkable candor, "We knew the war was lost when we understood your supply system. You violate every logistics rule we learned over decades of military experience. You waste fuel prodigiously. You abandon vehicles we would repair. You exhaust drivers beyond human endurance. Yet you succeed through sheer volume and speed that overwhelms every inefficiency. You've industrialized warfare beyond anything we imagined possible." The psychological impact on German forces at the tactical level was devastating in ways that transcended material shortages. Wehrmacht. Soldiers dug into defensive positions, could hear American trucks all night, every night. The endless sound of motors that never stopped became its own form of psychological warfare. German infantry knew they had 3 rounds per rifle, while Americans brought millions of rounds forward continuously. German artillery officers rationed shells carefully, while American guns fired preparatory barrages that consumed more ammunition in hours than German units received in weeks. The sound of American trucks became the sound of inevitable defeat. The vehicles themselves amazed German engineers who examined, captured, or abandoned examples with professional interest. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, the backbone of the Red Ball Express, represented mass production perfection that German industry couldn't match. General Motors had produced over 500,000 of these vehicles by war's end, more trucks than the entire German military possessed of all types, combined across all branches of service. The trucks featured innovations that Germany hadn't implemented as standard equipment. All-wheel drive was standard, not an expensive option. Automatic tire inflation systems allowed drivers to adjust pressure for different terrain without leaving the cab. Waterproofing permitted fording depths of 30 inches without preparation. Engines ran reliably on low-quality fuel without the careful tuning German vehicles required. Heaters actually worked in winter, unlike German trucks where drivers froze. More stunning to German engineers was American maintenance philosophy that represented fundamentally different thinking about mechanical assets. Where Germans meticulously rebuilt engines to extend vehicle service life, Americans simply replaced entire engines in 45 minutes and scrapped the old ones. Where Germans rationed spare parts as precious resources to be conserved, Americans discarded entire vehicles for relatively minor problems rather than delay repairs. Where Germans had master mechanics who could diagnose and repair complex failures, Americans had thousands of competent mechanics trained in rapid replacement procedures that got vehicles operational quickly, even if the repair wasn't elegant. As the front moved east during September, the Red Ball Express adapted with speed that stunned German planning officers accustomed to requiring weeks of preparation for major logistics reorganizations. When the original Chartres route became insufficient as American forces advanced beyond Paris, Americans created Red Ball Express extensions literally overnight. White Ball Express from Rouen to Paris became operational within 48 hours of the decision to create it. Green Diamond route from Cherbourg to railroad transfer points began moving supplies within 36 hours. Red Lion route supplying British forces in Belgium started operations in 2 days. ABC Express connecting Antwerp to Brussels to Charleroi after the port opened was functional, before German intelligence finished mapping the route. Each new route required traffic control points, fuel depots, maintenance facilities, and driver briefings. German staff officers required weeks to plan logistics operations of similar complexity. The Americans simply painted new route markers, assigned truck companies, provided drivers with hand-drawn maps, and started rolling. Planning happened while trucks were already moving. Refinements occurred through on-the-spot problem-solving rather than careful advance preparation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The predominance of African American drivers in the Red Ball Express created profound cognitive dissonance for German soldiers, whose indoctrination emphasized Nazi racial ideology. They had been taught that blacks were inferior, incapable of technical tasks, lacking initiative and discipline. Yet these drivers were performing logistics miracles that German forces with supposedly superior racial characteristics couldn't match. The contradiction was inescapable for any German soldier who observed Red Ball operations honestly. The African American soldiers understood the irony completely. They knew exactly what Nazi ideology said about them, which made their success even more satisfying. Every mile they drove proved Hitler wrong. Every deadline they met demonstrated that racial theories were propaganda lies. They were fighting racism with truck keys, defeating Nazi ideology through superior performance under conditions that would have broken soldiers of any race who lacked their determination. Some German prisoners, forced to work as laborers loading Red Ball trucks at supply depots, found their worldview fundamentally shattered by working alongside African American sergeants. These black NCOs calculated weight distributions faster than German engineers who had studied mathematics formally. They spoke better English than German soldiers who had taken English instruction in school. They treated prisoners fairly and professionally despite everything Nazi propaganda had told Wehrmacht soldiers about how supposedly inferior races behaved. The experience created doubts about Nazi ideology that no American propaganda could have instilled. The Red Ball Express required infrastructure that Germans deemed impossible to create under combat conditions while simultaneously maintaining operations. Yet Americans accomplished both. Engineers built or reinforced 40 bridges along Red Ball routes while convoys were running. They created 15 major fuel depots, each containing hundreds of thousands of gallons. They established 26 maintenance stations, with parts inventories and trained mechanics. They constructed 8 temporary cities for drivers, complete with mess facilities, sleeping quarters, and recreation areas, all while the operation was running at full capacity. The bridge at Mantes had been destroyed by German engineers, specifically to halt American logistics along one of the most direct routes toward Paris. Wehrmacht calculations showed replacement would require 6 weeks minimum using standard military bridge construction procedures. American engineers built a temporary Bailey Bridge capable of handling 2.5-ton trucks in 14 hours, while Red Ball convoys detoured only 8 miles on a hastily bulldozed bypass road. German prisoners working as laborers watched in disbelief as American engineering efficiency made their careful demolition work irrelevant within a day. German engineers observed American construction methods with amazement that transcended professional rivalry. Americans held no planning meetings that Germans could detect. They produced no detailed blueprints that German reconnaissance could capture. They simply started building with apparent chaos that somehow produced functional results in impossible timeframes. They built infrastructure faster than Germans could destroy it, creating supply routes that appeared overnight in French fields where nothing had existed the previous day. One Red Ball Express achievement particularly stunned German artillery officers monitoring American fire rates through observation and prisoner interrogation. American artillery units fired without ammunition restrictions, a luxury no German unit had enjoyed since 1942, when resource constraints began forcing careful rationing. During the reduction of Metz fortifications in September 1944, 20th Corps artillery fired 100,000 rounds in 24 hours. The Red Ball Express delivered every round plus 20% surplus reserves that German artillery officers considered criminally wasteful but undeniably effective. German artillery defending Metz was rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day, forcing careful selection of targets and elimination of harassing fire that might disrupt American preparations. The disparity was psychologically devastating. German gunners heard American artillery firing continuously for hours, knowing each bombardment consumed more ammunition than German units received in weeks, understanding that the endless American fire was possible because of the trucks they could hear at night bringing forward supplies that never seemed to run out. The calculation was inescapable. American guns fired continuously because Red Ball Express delivered 50 truckloads of ammunition per hour to forward artillery positions. German guns rationed carefully because horse-drawn supply wagons brought forward perhaps 10 tons daily if roads were passable and weather permitted. The technical quality of German artillery pieces exceeded American equivalents in many respects, but superior technology meant nothing when German guns fell silent for lack of ammunition while American artillery fired without restriction. The Red Ball Express consumed vehicles at rates that would have paralyzed any other military in history. By late September, mechanical attrition reached staggering proportions that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe represented sustainable losses. Average vehicle service life was 10,000 miles before requiring major mechanical work, compared to 30,000 miles under normal operating conditions. Daily deadline rates, vehicles too damaged or worn to operate, reached 30% of the total fleet. Engines were replaced at a rate of 500 weekly across all Red Ball units. Tires were consumed at 10,000 weekly, wearing out from constant high-speed operation on damaged roads. Total vehicles destroyed, abandoned, or permanently deadlined exceeded 5,000 during the operation's 83 days. Yet the operation never slowed from these catastrophic losses by German logistics standards. American production had anticipated such attrition rates and built them into planning. Liberty ships arrived weekly at French ports carrying hundreds of new GMC trucks still in cosmoline preservation coating. Replacement drivers were trained in 2-day courses that German instructors considered criminally inadequate, but which somehow produced competent operators anyway. Vehicles were transferred from lower priority units to keep Red Ball running at full capacity, regardless of mechanical losses elsewhere. German calculations showed Americans destroying more trucks weekly than the Wehrmacht possessed in all of France for all purposes. Yet American transport capacity increased rather than decreased as the campaign progressed. They had achieved something Germans thought impossible. Logistics capacity that grew faster than consumption could reduce it. They were producing and deploying trucks faster than combat, accidents, and mechanical failure could destroy them. French civilians living along Red Ball routes witnessed American abundance that contradicted years of German occupation characterized by systematic extraction and carefully rationed scarcity. The psychological impact on occupied populations was immediate and profound in ways that transcended military significance. These civilians had lived under German control since 1940, experiencing requisitions that took their food, their vehicles, their resources. They had been told Germany was winning, that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that Allied invasion would fail. Then American trucks appeared, thousands of them, rolling day and night with headlights blazing. The convoys carried more supplies in an hour than civilians had seen during years of German occupation. American soldiers, particularly African-American drivers, often shared their rations with French civilians, despite regulations prohibiting fraternization and resource sharing. Every supply stop brought children gathering around trucks. Drivers gave them chocolate, cigarettes for their parents, soap that had become precious under occupation. Americans gave away casually what Germans had rationed strictly. German intelligence reported the propaganda impact with growing concern. French civilian population now believes American victory is inevitable. They cite the truck convoys as primary evidence supporting this conclusion. Resistance activity has increased 400% along Red Ball routes as civilians feel emboldened by visible American strength. The population that accepted our occupation after 1940 now actively opposes it, hiding resistance members, cutting communication wires, and providing intelligence to American forces. The Red Ball Express has become psychological warfare as effective as any planned operation. In early September 1944, the Red Ball Express faced its greatest operational challenge as American forces advanced so far east that even this extraordinary system struggled to maintain delivery rates. The round-trip distance now exceeded 700 miles from Cherbourg to forward depots supplying Patton's spearheads approaching the German border. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. Vehicles were disintegrating from mechanical stress. German intelligence finally detected signs of strain they had predicted must appear eventually. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, reported on September 8 with cautious optimism. American supply lines show clear signs of approaching collapse. Convoy intervals have increased from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, indicating insufficient vehicle availability. Average speeds have decreased from 35 miles per hour to approximately 25 miles per hour, suggesting driver exhaustion and mechanical problems. This represents our first opportunity to exploit American logistics vulnerability. If we can hold defensive positions for 72 hours, American offensive operations must halt from supply exhaustion. But American adaptability again surprised German commanders who had assumed doctrine rigidity would prevent rapid reorganization. Within 72 hours of recognizing the strain, Red Ball Express had completely restructured operations in ways that would have required weeks of planning time in Wehrmacht. Americans created intermediate transfer points where loads were shifted between trucks, cutting individual driver runs from 700 miles to 350 miles. They implemented strict driver rotation systems enforced by military police who removed exhausted drivers from convoys, regardless of protests. They established forward maintenance bases that performed major repairs closer to operational areas. They doubled the number of trucks assigned to Red Ball from reserve units elsewhere in the theatre. By September 12, tonnage delivery had actually increased despite the crisis. German intelligence thought must cripple American logistics. The operational pause that should have halted Patton's advance lasted less than 48 hours before supplies were flowing at rates higher than before the crisis. German commanders who had anticipated finally exploiting American logistics limitations watched their opportunity disappear. As American industrial capacity and organizational flexibility overwhelmed problems through sheer scale and speed of response. Supplementing the Red Ball Express, Americans implemented another logistics solution. Germans deemed operationally impossible on the required scale. Large-scale aerial supply using C-47 transport aircraft began delivering critical supplies directly to forward units. bypassing road transport entirely for priority items. Each aircraft carried 3 tons of cargo. On September 16, 1944, Wehrmacht observers counted 900 transport flights in a single day, delivering 2,700 tons by air. The Luftwaffe, at its peak effort during Stalingrad encirclement, had managed 300 tons daily to surrounded German forces and considered that an extraordinary maximum effort requiring every available transport aircraft. The Americans used their transport planes like flying trucks, making multiple sorties daily with no concerns about fighter escort because Allied air superiority was absolute. They assumed aircraft losses to accidents and mechanical failure, accepted them as operational overhead, and simply deployed enough planes that losses didn't matter. The Wehrmacht couldn't compete with this industrial arithmetic. Germany had built approximately 1,500 transport aircraft of all types during the entire war. America had produced over 10,000 C-47s alone, more transport capacity than Germany could have operated, even with unlimited fuel, because pilot training and maintenance infrastructure couldn't support such numbers, even if the aircraft existed. The Red Ball Express operated under command principles that violated German military hierarchy in ways that baffled observers accustomed to rigid Wehrmacht organization. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains, made operational decisions that would require general officer approval in German forces. Sergeants commanded operations larger than German colonels typically managed. Drivers made route adjustments and tactical decisions on the spot without requesting permission from higher headquarters. This decentralization baffled German officers who captured American logistics documents. The system appeared to operate without apparent central control. Every lieutenant acted with authority German doctrine reserved for field-grade officers. Every sergeant made decisions that Wehrmacht doctrine required officer approval to authorize. This should have created chaos. Instead, Americans achieved efficiency. Wehrmacht couldn't match despite rigid hierarchy and careful planning. The explanation, clear in retrospect, though incomprehensible to German military culture, was that American military doctrine emphasized mission accomplishment over procedural compliance. Junior leaders were trained to understand the overall objective and empowered to make whatever decisions furthered that objective. This created adaptability and speed that rigid hierarchy couldn't match. By October 1944, advancing railheads as French rail infrastructure was repaired began to reduce Red Ball Express requirements. The operation that was supposed to be a temporary expedient lasting perhaps 10 days had continued for 82 days, delivering 412,000 tons of supplies over 122 million ton miles. This represented logistics performance exceeding anything achieved in military history. German commanders, now fighting desperate defensive battles on their own borders, reflected on what they had witnessed with the clarity defeat sometimes provides. Field Marshal Model wrote in his final operational report before Germany's collapse, "We were not defeated primarily by American tanks, though they were numerous and well handled. We were not defeated primarily by American aircraft, though Allied air superiority was overwhelming. We were defeated by American trucks." The Red Ball Express proved that in modern war, logistics is strategy. The side that can deliver more supplies faster wins, regardless of tactical skill or operational brilliance. The transition to rail transport was itself a marvel that demonstrated American engineering capacity. American railroad engineers had reconstructed 1,000 miles of destroyed French rail lines while the Red Ball was running, often working within sight and sound of Red Ball convoys moving on parallel roads. They laid new track faster than Germans had destroyed it during their retreat. They rebuilt bridges, cleared destroyed equipment, and restored signal systems in time frames. German railway officials considered physically impossible. Much of this reconstruction used captured German rail equipment pressed into American service. German locomotives were repainted and operated by American engineers. German rail cars carried American supplies. The irony of seeing their own equipment serving American logistics wasn't lost on German prisoners working repair details, who watched trains assembled from captured Wehrmacht rolling stock, carrying supplies that sustained armies. Advancing into Germany, The final Red Ball Express statistics defied every German calculation of logistical possibility and represented achievements that would influence military logistics doctrine for generations. 82 days of continuous operations from August 25th through November 16th, 1944. 412,193 tons of supplies delivered to forward combat units. 122 million ton-miles of transport capacity, representing the equivalent of moving 1 ton 122 million miles. 5,958 vehicles in average daily operation, with peaks exceeding 7,000 trucks. 23,000 total drivers employed in rotation throughout the operation's duration. 700,000 gallons of gasoline consumed daily just for Red Ball operations, separate from fuel transported forward. 40,000 tons of ammunition delivered specifically to Patton's Third Army. 15 million rations transported to feed advancing armies. 135,000 tons of medical supplies moved forward to support casualty treatment. Reviewing these figures after capture, German logistics officers admitted they had calculated American logistics capacity based on European historical precedent and were wrong by an order of magnitude. They had studied Wehrmacht logistics performance, multiplied by 3 to account for superior American industrial capacity, and assumed that represented American maximum capability. They were wrong by a factor of 10. American logistics capacity exceeded German calculations by such margins that the comparison became meaningless. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.